Hello, I'm Bruce Zimmerman, and this is the Open Line Garden Show podcast for this week. Rhododendrons are just finishing blooming in my garden, and these are normally what I would call a May bloomer, but we've been so cold, dry, and now wet that the blooms have come much, much later, and it's now time to deal with the blooms. And with rhododendrons, you never want to fertilize them in this far north in Canada once you hit July 1st. So you really want to try and make sure that the feeding is all done. So we need to get some work done. First of all, it's time to deadhead. Now, some people won't deadhead big old plants they can't reach the top of if they get that large. If they are manageable and you can get in and deadhead, you should. And at the same time, this is the time when you may have to do a little selective pruning. This is important if you're going to maintain shape on some varieties or size. Others, you just want to grow into big, huge trees. Well, that's a whole different matter. You can just let them go. But I prefer to deadhead as much as possible, because it puts all the energy back into growth and into the plant. Now, once you've deadheaded, and this is important, you want to make sure, by the way, that the leaves are trimmed, and you'll see the new growth starting to emerge just behind the rhododendron bloom. So you can snap them out, you can snip them out, but I prefer to snip. I usually get a little bit of a cleaner cut. The new growth takes over, and of course, nothing goes to seed. So all the energy goes to growth. Now, it's time to mulch, and it's time to feed. A lot of people will feed and then mulch. It's really up to you to know your plants and the plants that you're actually doing. I prefer to feed and then mulch. And what you want is a good rhododendron food. There are several. There are those that are water soluble, and there's some that are organic. I prefer the organic ones. And yes, they do smell an awful lot. And yes, you'll probably want to change your clothes and have a shower when you're finished doing all the feeding. So time your feeding to do all the evergreens that require your organic fertilizer for acid plants, things like the dogwoods. I'd like to do those. I'd like to do the Helleborus, and some of the hostas I find do very well if you do the organic food with them. The rhododendrons are then ready to mulch, and it should be an acid mulch. Usually it's a peat mulch. There are peat moss mulches. There are peat bog mulches. All of them will work, but most of the peat moss has been lime adjusted to about 6.5. Rhododendrons prefer a pH of around 5.5 would be good. Some a little more, some a little less, and therefore more tolerant. Remember that rhododendrons generally do not put their roots down, but put them up. And as a result, you want to make sure that mulch is going on. The reason that they put them up is that's just the way they were bred through time. And so if you're going to realize that the roots are growing up, this is why a lot of people prefer to fertilize after they mulch and let the rain and the moisture drive the fertilizer down through the new mulch and to the emerging roots. It's up to you which way you do it, and you know your rhodos, you can do it. Some of the small leafed rhodos don't really get deadheaded. It's probably too onerous work to sit there and take off several hundred blooms off a plant that's only 2 feet across. But the big ones, I do prefer to go ahead and, in this case, deadhead. Another plant that does like the food that is rhododendron food is magnolia. They can be fed at this time of year as well, unless, of course, they're a southern magnolia. They should have been fed a little earlier, and they being a evergreen, needs to be fed and kept watered. If it's going into drought, you don't fertilize, you water, and then let the plant absorb the moisture and then fertilize, and make sure that you maintain a decent moisture level. With in our gardens right now, the winter has been so hard that many of the rhododendrons that are, let's say, summer bloomers are still leafing. They're still breaking. They're still growing. So don't over push them. You're certain they're not going to get frost, but make sure they're getting adequate moisture so that they can leaf out. Some of the hardier hydrangeas are actually in bud, and so you want to wait until they're budded out and flowered before you give them a little bit of a plant food. The climbing hydrangeas are in full bloom at the moment. It's been spectacular for them, even in basically a tough winter. They have responded to this cool, moist weather we've been having for the last 6 weeks. And the idea is that you get a flathead of white flowers that are slightly fragrant, about 3-4 inches across. Well, this year they have to be at least 5 to 7 inches across. They are just gorgeous, and they've really started to leaf out and grow with the moisture and the fertilizer that we've been applying throughout the spring. Turf is a little dry, so watch out. And yet, there are times when we get too much. Last Sunday, we got 3 inches of rain in a single day. We've had rain off and on since. But every time the rain shows up, and we get, let's say, half an inch or an inch of rain, it suddenly disappears. In other words, it's still dry. Even with all this rain, the soil is still absorbing the lack of moisture that we had in April. So let's say in the last 3 weeks, or let's call it 2 weeks, we've had 4 inches of rain, and we're still not soaking wet, and the ground is just moist. The plants that do like this cool weather with the cool nights, warm days, and moisture are just going great guns. The Shasta daisies, the echinaceas, all of them are doing fantastic in the garden. The helleborus are actually doing extremely well. Hostas are sizing up nicely if they are getting adequate moistures. If they're in under the trees, you may actually have to give them more water. So augment the water where you feel that they have not gotten a lot of moisture. I have a couple of situations where the hostas under my variegated Zelkovia do need extra moisture and extra food. The ones that are further out in the quiet garden in other areas of the yard are just going great guns. They're growing like weeds. Siberian iris are just finishing, so you want to go in and snip out the canes. Now, I like to take out as much of the flower stalk as possible because they always look ugly later on in the season as they turn brown. So go in and be gentle, because if you over move the leaves, let's say you're a little too rough with them, they have a tendency to splay out rather than stand up. And it becomes slightly unattractive to have this sort of Siberian iris with leaves in every direction but up. The yuccas are starting to grow. They haven't had the heat, and so they haven't really started to push growth in my garden. Whether it's Color Guard, whether it's Baccata, all of them are just basically hanging in there, the little bit of growth, etc. The containers in my garden are doing very well. They don't get a lot of moisture. The soil mixes are just that. They're mixes, and they're fairly well drained. They're keeping their moisture with the continual addition of Mother Nature's rainfall. But some of them do need to be tipped out, simply because they are getting a little too much at one time. So they have started to grow. They're doing very, very well, particularly the begonias and the Rex begonias as well. Miss Montreal is doing just fantastic. I'm looking forward to seeing more of those out in the market this year and next year for sure. The other ones that are doing really well in the garden are petunias. Now, the petunias are only doing well where the soil mix is really well drained. They're moist, but they're blooming even though we're getting all this moisture and not much of the way of sun. But they are blooming, they are growing. Some of them are a little vegetative. I'd like to see more bloom on the petunias, but then who wouldn't, right? So keep gardening, keep going at it. Remember, the weather will change. We'll certainly get into this heat and summer and drought, and we'll need to start watering heavily. Think of it this way. It's saving us a lot of money on watering, which is always a good thing. And so be careful with that. Remember that tomatoes and eggplants and peppers are all tropicals. They like the heat and they don't mind slightly cooler night temperatures. And we're getting that, but keep the soil moist. Keep all the water off the foliage as much as possible. No soil splashing onto the bottom foliage. This only encourages diseases. And watch out for insects, which so far have not really been bothering anybody. Maybe they don't like the rain either. But I can tell you the mosquitoes do. So make sure you're looking after the mosquitoes in your yard. No standing water. And that's very, very important. If you have a bird bath, tip it out every 2 days. Whether it rains or not, tip it out. Get fresh water in there. The birds will appreciate it, but the mosquitoes won't use it as a breeding pond. And that's just what you don't want. If you have a fish pond, make sure that the fish are active. Don't overfeed them so that they're eating the larvae of the mosquitoes. A lot of people will put a water garden feature somewhere fairly near the sitting area so they can look at the fish and look at the water garden and, of course, the waterfalls, etc. But if you don't look after the mosquitoes in there, by not feeding the fish and put in some old goldfish if you have to. Let them eat the larvae, and that'll keep down the mosquitoes there. And they'll basically be working for you. I'm Bruce Zimmerman. This is the Open Line Garden Show podcast for this week.